Hey everybody, I'm Scott. It's fundraising time again at antiwar.com. We need your help, and here's how you can help. Stop by antiwar.com/donate or call Angela Keaton, our development director, at 323-512-7095. That's 323-512-7095, or you can shoot her an email over to akeaton@antiwar.com.
Thank you very much for your support.
All right, y'all, welcome back to the show. It's Anti-War Radio. And our next guest is Dr. Gareth Porter. He's a reporter for Interpress Service, an independent historian and journalist, author of 4 or 5 books, which you can find on any book website other than Amazon.com, which all good people are boycotting. He has an archive at antiwar.com/Porter that is pretty much all-inclusive, at least of his IPS pieces and a few others as well. And that soon enough, I hope, will include this brand new one for the journal Middle East Policy, which is put out by the Middle East Policy Council. And it is called Evidence of Fraud in Alleged Studies Docs. The Iran Nuclear Alleged Studies Documents. The Evidence of Fraud is actually the actual title. Welcome back to the show. Gareth, how are you doing?
I'm good. Thanks very much for having me again. Thanks.
I was reading the top bar, not the big, bold headline. It's called The Iran Nuclear Alleged Studies Documents. The Evidence of Fraud by Gareth Porter. And it's basically the summation of all your reporting on this issue over the last few years, basically, I guess. A few new, bows tied with ribbons to seal the deal all together here. But basically, Dr. Porter, you say here there are 8 major indicators that something called the alleged studies documents are fraudulent. So I guess, first of all, tell us what these documents are, why we ought to care that they're fraudulent, and then we can go through your 8 reasons if we could.
Sure, yeah, let's do that, because I think it's really important for people to get an overall sense of the number of indicators of fraud, which is something that otherwise we might miss in this program. So, yeah, to begin with, the importance of the documents is that, this is really overwhelmingly the primary and almost sole source of documentary evidence to support the notion that Iran has, in fact, actively engaged in nuclear weapons-related research. These documents allegedly pertain, they are purportedly documents pertaining to the period from 2001 to 2003, or actually 2004. And in fact, to be more precise, the earliest date of any of the documents, as far as I've been able to ascertain, is in fact early 2002. So it would be more accurate to say 2002 to 2004. And they're really centrally important politically in the issue because the Obama administration, even today, continues to assert that the Iranians are not eligible for being treated as any normal state in regard to issues of diplomacy because they are not adequately cooperating with, or not cooperating at all, with the IAEA investigation, quote-unquote, of its nuclear program, of specifically the military-related aspects of its military program. Now, I just want to point out this is an absolutely key point in my view because of the relationship to this point to the international politics of the issue. The reason the Iranians ceased their cooperation with the IAEA in September 2008 is that they had been given a request, a demand, I think it's fair to say, under the circumstances, from the IAEA for the technical drawings, essentially the blueprints of their Shahab-3 missile, on the grounds that it was necessary to discuss these designs for their missile in order to prove that they had not actually put together designs for redesigned a warhead for the Shahab-3 to accommodate a nuclear weapon, which was the premise of some of the key documents in the laptop documents. So the reason the Iranians said, no, we're not going to cooperate anymore, is that they were essentially crossing a red line, which was to ask the Iranians to give them military secrets, very highly classified, highly secretive documents, which the IAEA really had no business asking for. And, of course, there's really no rationale, no reasonable rationale for a request of that nature if you are simply trying to figure out if these documents are fraudulent or not, because asking the Iranians for the blueprints for the Shahab 3 would not be dispositive. It would not prove anything whatsoever. And I questioned people at IAEA about that and got, I must say, rather squirrely answers, nothing very clear in response, except for one senior official who, off the record, agreed that, in fact, they were asking the Iranians to give up military secrets and to compromise their security. He said, well, you know, they're going to have to do that in order to satisfy it. So that's the significance of the documents.
Okay, so in other words, the International Atomic Energy Agency is asking the Iranians to come off with all this information that, as Dr. Gordon Prather would say, is none of the IAEA's beeswax.
That's right.
Under the Safeguards Agreement. But they're going after them and telling them, give us the blueprints to your missiles, answer every question, let us inspect where you make your centrifuges, never mind, you know, whether actual nuclear material is being introduced into them, like would make it under the Safeguards Agreement part of the IAEA's business. And the reason, the basis for the IAEA's extra investigations here are these alleged studies documents. And these, then the Iranians' refusal to go along with all this is what makes them the bad guy that can't be dealt with, that maybe we need to bomb them because they just won't cooperate with the IAEA.
Right, and just one more point in regard to the request for the military secrets. The Iranians actually were prepared to accommodate the request for some of the other things that they want, that the IAEA were requested to do, that is, visit some of the places that were mentioned in these documents. At one point, there was actually, according to this is my interview with Olli Heinonen, who's now at Harvard University, Kennedy School. He told me that the Iranians had agreed to allow them to visit some of these sites, but then they changed their mind, and I have to believe that this was a political decision based on the fact that the IAEA also requested these military secrets, and that the decision was made that in order to safeguard the position of Iran in relation to its rights to keep military secrets away from the IAEA and the rest of the international community, that they had to draw the line and say, you know, unless the IAEA changes its stance, we're not going to cooperate with them anymore.
Mm-hmm. Well, now, people might remember back in November of 2007, the National Intelligence Council, that's the head of the CIA and the other 16 intelligence agencies, they came together and put out a national intelligence estimate that said the Iranians do not now have a nuclear weapons program. They stopped it in 2003. Now, is there any other indication that they ever had a nuclear weapons program in the time, I don't know how many years leading up to 2003, like it says in that NIE, other than these alleged studies documents, Dr. Porter?
What the NIE found, or what the intelligence community found in the process of doing the research on the National Intelligence Estimate in 2007, was multiple sources which indicated that the military people, among others, military officers were upset with what was characterized by the Washington Post, New York Times, and I think Los Angeles Times as well, as a halt or as a stoppage of work on nuclear weapons. But the question is what, in fact, they actually heard or saw in notebooks or intercepted conversations. That's not at all clear.
All right, well, we'll have to pick that up on the other side of this break. It's Dr. Gareth Porter, journalist for Interpress Service, and his new piece is out in the Middle East Policy Journal, the Iran Nuclear Alleged Studies Documents, the Evidence of Fraud. We'll be right back. All right, y'all, welcome back to the show. It's Anti-War Radio. I'm Scott Horton. I'm talking with Gareth Porter for the 110th time or something on this show. And we're talking about his new piece in a journal called Middle East Policy, put out by the Middle East Policy Council. It's called the Iran Nuclear Alleged Studies Documents, the Evidence of Fraud. And when we went out to break, Gareth, I had asked you, was there any other indication other than these documents that you're about to explain to us why they're bogus, that says that the Iranians ever had a nuclear weapons program, even leading up to 2003 when the National Intelligence Estimate of 2007 said that they quit? And you said, yeah, well, they say that they heard a guy complaining that it had been shut down. But is there anything else?
No, nothing else. And I just wanted to add, with regard to that evidence, that we just don't know exactly what they, in fact, had in their hands. Because of the news coverage that only gives us one version of what they found, and we have no way of knowing how accurate that description of what they found is. But it's a very vague description of something that is supposed to correspond with a halt. Now, I simply want to make a general point about the intelligence community with regard to the Iranian nuclear program. The record of that intelligence community over the last 2 decades on this subject is so bad and so in one direction, that is to say, so exaggerating the desire of the Iranian government for a nuclear weapon as fast as possible, that it is impossible for me to believe that they were not, in fact, essentially reaching a compromise here, that they would acknowledge that Iran does not now have an active nuclear weapons-related program or a nuclear weapons research program, as long as they could say that, yes, we can now ascertain that they did, in fact, have one before. That's very easy for me to believe, because the entire history of national intelligence estimates and their findings, their main conclusions, is that they were negotiated. They were negotiated sort of differences between 2 points of view, one of which was more extreme with regard to its view of Iranian intentions, and the other was more moderate in terms of saying we don't really know what their intentions are. So, I think it's entirely not just plausible but likely that this finding, that this conclusion that they did in fact have a nuclear weapons program in this period was in the way of a compromise between these 2 points of view.
Well, sure, and we've heard on the upcoming NIE, which has been put off on Iran's nuclear program, that from Phil Giraldi, for example, says he has sources inside the government who know about this, and they tell him that they're still debating this. They don't have any new evidence to say that things have changed, but the politics are such that they need to compromise even more and basically put an even worse spin on the very same facts, the ones that, as you point out, they were already spinning 4 years ago.
That sounds precisely right to me, absolutely.
Okay, now, so let's get into point 1 through 8, because if all this hype about the Iranians are being dishonest and they're not being forthcoming and they're refusing to answer our questions, our very reasonable questions, and they're stonewalling us and they must be preparing to wipe Israel off the face of the earth, if all that's based on these alleged studies documents and you say I shouldn't believe that they're real, I want to hear why.
Very good. Let's run through the 8 points that I've laid out here and detailed in the study that's just been published. The first one, the one that I think is really most important, most dramatic, if you will, is that the so-called warhead schematics, the drawings of, I think, about 18 different ways of redesigning the nose cone, the warhead, so-called, of the Shahab-3 missile, is... these drawings were supposedly the smoking gun evidence that they were about to come up with a new missile that would redesigned missile that would have a nuclear weapon attached to it. And what I found from putting various pieces of information together is that these schematics actually show the warhead of a missile, that is Shahab-3, that was no longer in development by the Iranian government, by the Iranian Defense Ministry. They had already abandoned the Shahab-3 in favor of a new and improved version, which was given a completely different name, the Ghadr-1, and which was first tested in July, I believe it was, or August 2004. And when they tested that missile, there were pictures associated with it which proved that the new warhead was completely different from the one that was shown in these schematics that were alleged to be part of this nuclear weapons program. So, long story short, this is, I think, the most important piece of evidence that these were fraudulent documents.
Well, and you really explain in the piece, too, that nobody really knew. You went back and checked all the media and everything. Nobody knew that they were coming out with this new design. It made perfect sense to think that someone forging these documents would say, yeah, here, we're going to make it look like they're trying to fit a nuclear weapon on top of this missile that we all know they use. But then, meanwhile, it turns out that, nope, they'd already secretly abandoned that old missile for this new one, and so the people who forged the documents are just busted, basically. There's no way. It doesn't make any sense, and you really do deconstruct all this piece by piece in the article. It doesn't make any sense in the world to think that they would be making a nuclear bomb to fit a missile that they've already discarded.
They're entirely busted, and when I quizzed Olli Heinonen on this is really the key point, I think. When I confronted Olli Heinonen at Harvard a few months ago, he really did not have an answer to this. His first answer was, well, it's clear that this outfit which was doing the schematics was really not working for the missile program at all. Well, okay, how can it be that you're secretly doing a nuclear weapons program, and the primary evidence of it is that you're redesigning the warhead for your missile, and yet you're not even in touch with the missile program? There's no relationship to the missile program. Well, that doesn't make any sense at all, of course. And then he went on to say, though, this could just be a kind of feasibility study, nothing more than that. It's really quite lame, and I think the real importance of this is that just as you said, the people who faked these documents had every reason to believe that the Shahab-3 was still the missile. There was no advance warning, as the lead author of the IISS study of the Iranian missile program pointed out to me before the test of August of 2004. So let's face it was the Israelis behind this. The Israelis thought that they were on sound ground, but they were caught off base here.
Yeah, well, and as far as the Israelis being behind it, we'll get to that. But now, real quick, well, we don't even have time. When we get back, we're going to spend the next half of this hour going over the rest of the 8 reasons why people ought to question the credibility of these so-called alleged studies. Again, the entire basis, basically, for the Americans and the international community to beat the Iranians over the head with the Non-Proliferation Treaty and the Safeguards Agreement that they are entirely within and obeying. And yet we get to sit here and pretend all day that they're in violation of something based on these documents that really have no credibility at all. The piece, again, is called the Iran Nuclear Alleged Studies Documents, the Evidence of Fraud, by Dr. Gareth Porter. It's in the journal Middle East Policy, put out by the Middle East Policy Council. We will be running it at antiwar.com, and that'll be antiwar.com/Porter. Hang tight. We'll be right back, y'all. All right, y'all, welcome back to the show. It's Anti-War Radio. Online is Dr. Gareth Porter, antiwar.com/Porter. And we're talking about his new piece in the Middle East Policy Journal. It's called Iran Nuclear Alleged Studies Documents, the Evidence of Fraud. And, well, I guess if you missed the summary of what we're talking about here, go back to the beginning. I want to pick it up where we left off, which is point number 2. And I guess, from the look of it here, Gareth, we could sort of make this point 2, 4, and 6 and what have you, because a lot of it has to do with an Iranian company called Kimia Madan. That's and right. How the fact of this Kimia Madan's existence means that the military in Iran is making nuclear weapons and they're going to wipe Israel off the map with it.
Yeah, Kenyan is a company that clearly did have a contract with the Iranian government related to the nuclear program, at least indirectly. That is the ore conversion project, the ore processing project that the Atomic Energy Agency of Iran had hired this company to help set up. But the key thing here about the laptop documents is that they include documents that suggest that there was such a thing as a Project 5, which had a few sub-projects in it, one of which is a project for uranium conversion, which is given the number project code number, Project 5/15. This ore processing project, it turns out, because Iran turned all of the relevant documents over to the IAEA, turns out that this code number was given to the project 2.5 years before the beginning of this purported nuclear weapons-related research project by the Atomic Energy Organization, the Civilian Atomic Energy Organization, not by the military. And so the entire premise of the laptop documents that Kenyan was working for the military as part of this purported project is simply busted.
And as you show again in the piece, it's perfectly reasonable to see how forgers would think that there's a hole in the information available big enough that we can fit a secret Iranian military project in there. It wasn't until after they forged these documents that more and more and more information came out to show that no, it was the Civilian Atomic Energy Agency and not the military that had created this company to do this work.
Well, this is interesting. You see, I think that in fact, I'm firmly convinced that the Israelis did in fact believe that Kenyan was working for the military, that the military was really behind the management of this the uranium ore mine, and that they were simply acting on their own suspicions when they created these documents, including this one specifically that had Kenyan working specifically for the military. But what they didn't anticipate is that the Iranians could prove that this company, in fact, was under contract only with the Civilian Atomic Energy Agency. So that's where, again, they were caught off base and proven to be basically frauds.
Mm-hmm. And now, do I understand right that this project was basically the bench-level laser enrichment green salt project, or this is also includes uranium mining and conversion to yellow cake and everything?
I was not clear. There is more than one alleged project as part of this, or sub-projects as part of this Project 5. One of them was this ore processing project, but then another one was just the one that you referred to, the green salt sub-project. And in fact, strangely enough, the entire collection of documents were once called the green salt documents, simply because of this one bench-scale outline of a process for uranium conversion, which had Kenyan's name on it. And the interesting thing about this bench-scale setup shown in the drawing, of course, it's not available. You've never seen it unless you're part of the intelligence community or the IAEA. But the interesting thing is that the Iranians took one look at it and they said, hey, wait a minute, there's obvious flaws in this. This doesn't make any sense. And in this case, Oli Heinemann had to actually publicly admit that the Iranians were correct, that this one-page flow sheet actually contained fundamental errors in it, indicating that the people who did it weren't really that sharp.
Well, I had a point of confusion, actually, about this part of the article, because I guess what I thought, and I'm no nuclear scientist, but I know Doc Prather, and what I thought was that the laser enrichment, assuming the truth of this at all, that the bench-level laser enrichment would be to convert the refined uranium ore into uranium tetrafluoride, 5 fluorides, fluoride gas attached to one uranium atom in the molecule.
Correct.
And yet it's uranium hexafluoride, 6 fluorides per uranium, that is the gas that is needed to be injected into the spinning centrifuges in order to actually enrich the uranium, and they already have a plant at Isfahan which makes the hexafluoride. And so why in the world would they want to enrich up to tetrafluoride green salt when you don't need that for anything? They're already skipping that step down the street.
Well, I think that's absolutely correct. And I mean,
I'm not sure you make that point in the piece, do you?
Pardon?
I'm not sure you make that point in the piece, because I thought I read in there that you had hexafluoride would be produced by the laser enrichment. Maybe that was an editing mistake, or I'm not sure. Maybe it's my mistake.
I'm not sure about that that specific point, but the more general point that it was not necessary is obviously correct. That they already had this process for uranium conversion, which they had tested, time after time. They had not just experimented with it; they had tested it for years, and they were satisfied that this was the way they were going to go. And the idea that they were going to start all over again with another process is simply ridiculous. And this is, to me, this is the stupidest thing in the entire collection of documents, because it's just inexplicable that the Israelis believed that they could get away with, with such an error, such an obvious inconsistency with the known facts about the uranium program.
In the second, in the last segment, I want to talk as much as possible about the indications of where these documents come from, the Israelis, as you just indicated. But I wanted to finish up in this segment. We still have a couple of minutes left, and I wanted you to please talk a little bit about the lack of official markings and any other of the major indications of fraud that you think need to be highlighted here, Gareth.
Okay, so pick and choose of the remaining ones. Which ones are most important? Let's begin with the lack of security markings, and as well as official stamps on those documents that are actual letters from official offices of the Iranian military setup, or to the Iranian military. This was the point that the Iranian ambassador to the IAEA pointed out to me that was an obvious question mark about the documents from the very beginning. How can you have documents that are supposedly part of a top-secret nuclear weapons project which don't have security markings on them? And so I asked the senior official of the IAEA, remaining unnamed because he refused to be identified, what about this? And the official admitted that, that is an issue that does have some relevance here, but he said, we don't know the answer. We don't know whether there were such stamps on the originals because we have not been able to find that out.
All right, hold it right there, and we can pick up a couple of more of the important points if you want on the other side of this break. Then we're going to talk about the communist terrorist cult, the Mujahideen al-Khalq. It was Bo and T, then Bo died. Now it's just T rules that thing, and their role in this, as well as the Israeli Mossad. It's Gareth Porter from Interpress Service on Anti-War Radio. We'll be right back. All right, kiddos, welcome back to the show. It's Anti-War Radio. I'm Scott Horton, and I'm talking with Dr. Gareth Porter about his new piece, the Iran Nuclear Alleged Studies Documents, the Evidence of Fraud. And it's really the summation of a lot of reporting that he's done on this very question over the last few years. It's in the journal Middle East Policy, put out by the Middle East Policy Council, and I'm going to be calling them this afternoon for reprint rights so we can run it at antiwar.com. And now the issue of these alleged studies is very important. These are the documents that the Americans and then therefore the so-called international community use to basically pretend that the Iranians are in defiance of the legitimate demands of the international community that they, be above board and stop violating their international agreements, when in fact they're not a violation of their international agreements, but for the evidence in this so-called smoking laptop. and the so-called alleged studies documents. And so Dr. Porter is going through the reasons why not to believe that these documents are even legitimate at all. The core of the war party's case against the Iranians. And now when we left off, we were at the stamps and seals that are lacking from these documents. Dr. Porter, go ahead.
Right. Yes, let me take you back. One of the arguments, if not the main argument that is made about this issue, is that, well, when you have these documents that have been purloined or captured or whatever from the other side, you can't keep the original stamps and, you can't keep the security markings on there because they would be indicators of exactly which person had given the document to the intelligence community or gotten it out of Iran and so forth. And in other words, the lack of such markings would be simply normal practice by the intelligence community to safeguard the identity of the Iranian who might have provided these documents. So the question then becomes: let's take that as a legitimate reason for not having the security markings on these documents as they are being circulated in the IAEA. The question then is, okay, is the IAEA interested in doing a serious investigation of this or not? If they're interested in doing a serious investigation, did they ask the United States government for a copy of the originals to see whether they had the security markings on them in the originals? And if not, why not? And so I asked that question to the senior IAEA official, and he admitted that they had, he admitted in effect that they had not asked the United States because he said they didn't know. And I asked Ole Heinen the same question when I interviewed him. He refused to answer the question. And so I think it's very clear that the net result of this is that the IAEA was not really interested in doing a serious investigation because they didn't ask the obvious question. They didn't ask for the same evidence that they asked for in the case of the Nigergate document. They insisted on getting the original document so they could examine it, and after 2 or 3 weeks, the U.S. government finally coughed it up. They didn't do that in this case.
Right. And, of course, after 2 or 3 minutes, they had finished debunking those Niger uranium documents using Google back at the time. Okay, now, so tell me a little bit about the various narratives spun by the Washington Post and German newspapers and others around the world about how the Americans came to possess these documents in the first place and how, where you think they really came from.
This is one of the most interesting aspects of the whole story of the laptop documents. It's the narrative, as you correctly put it, of how they came out of Iran, supposedly. Where did they really come from? Who brought them out? Whose documents were these? The original cover story, the one that was published by the Post and the Times in 2005, was, and this is, of course, from anonymous U.S. intelligence sources, was that these documents came from a laptop which had been owned by an Iranian engineer who was part of this purported nuclear weapons program in Iran. Well, it turns out that that's really not true. It turns out that these documents were not brought out on a laptop. At least the current cover story is that they weren't on a laptop actually at all. They were in some other form, presumably as CDs, and they were put on a laptop by presumably the United States or somebody else after they came out of Iran. So, then the additional, sort of new narrative is that the person who got them out of Iran was, in fact, an Iranian businessman who was doing business with the government, doing construction on all of these nuclear facilities. Well, that's interesting because somebody who was doing construction would never have been given the kind of access that would be demanded to have all of these various parts of this secret nuclear weapons program brought together in one place. So, the whole story just reeks of fraud from the very beginning.
All right, now, before we get into the positive evidence that you have of the involvement of the Israelis, the Mujahideen al-Khalq, or inferences or what have you, I wanted to get to the one last negative, which was that Mohamed ElBaradei never believed in these documents, correct?
That is correct. As far as we know, from the very beginning, when they first arrived, he was very skeptical that they were not authentic, and never lent his name to the documents as being a credible source of documentation on this question. And this was reported by the two Israeli journalists, the two Israeli co-authors of the book on the Iranian nuclear program, published in 2007, if I remember correctly, that they said that high officials of the IAEA were not believers in the authenticity of the documents from the beginning. The Israelis pressed ElBaradei very strongly through their European allies, particularly the Germans and the French and the British, to publish a report that was based on the laptop documents, essentially, and ElBaradei refused to buckle under, and that's when the Europeans then leaked the document that he had supposedly kept in his drawer, which he refused to publish along with one of their regular reports, so there was a sort of campaign through the news media, particularly Associated Press, AFP, publishing stories accusing ElBaradei of keeping all these secret information, secret intelligence about the Iranian nuclear program away from the world's public. And all of this was orchestrated, as the Israelis themselves admitted, by the Israeli Foreign Ministry and the Israeli ambassador to the IAEA.
Okay, now, so give us every indication you got where these documents really came from, how they ended up in the hands of the CIA.
Well, look, the Israelis are obviously the main country, the main intelligence service, which had both the high degree of motivation as well as the capability and the opportunity to manufacture these documents. And a key piece of information here, which people should know about, is that the Israelis had, in 2003, when these documents had to have been fabricated, they already had in being a part of Mossad, International Intelligence Agency of Israel, which was devoted entirely to trying to influence the world's media and governments with regard to the Iranian nuclear program. They were leaking information, including alleged or purported documents that were, supposed to have been within the Iranian government, the documents of the Iranian government on this subject. That, in my mind, is very convincing evidence that this was simply the primary piece of work that was done by that Office of Mossad in 2003. And, we also know that the people in the CIA, some of the analysts in the CIA were quite skeptical of these when they first came along, and they figured that they were from Israel because the Israelis had been trying to pressure the CIA to adopt the Israeli viewpoint on the Iranian nuclear program completely. And the CIA was somewhat reluctant. The CIA was a bit more objective than the Israelis are about this, and there was a lot of tension between the CIA and Mossad during that period when these documents first arrived. George Tenet did not like what the Israelis were trying to do, figured the Israelis were trying to set the United States up for support for an attack on Iran, as was reported by a pro-Israeli news agency at the time. So we have, a number of reasons to see the Israelis as being behind this.
All right. Well, also, we didn't get to talk too much about the Mujahideen al-Khalq, but I urge everybody to look up this great article, the Iran Nuclear Alleged Studies Documents, the Evidence of Fraud. Hopefully soon enough it'll be running at antiwar.com. And just Google Gareth Porter, Iran laptop, and you'll find lots of great journalism on this issue going back years and years. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me, Scott.
That's Dr. Gareth Porter, y'all.